to moje kočnice. Recimo ono što mene zna izbaciti iz takta je zlouporaba nadmoćnog položaja. Kad neki, recimo referent koji je dobio neku moć, odluči to iskoristiti na način da ja sad imam 7 dana posve nepotrebnog posla i stresa. A s druge strane, kad se to dogodi, primijetim, između ostalog primijetim zato što se ja i pripremim na to. Ako idem sad predat neki dokument u nadležno tijelo, ja znam da je tako nešto moguće. Da će me izbaciti vani jer nisam donio izvod iz matične knjige rođenih stariji od 6 mjeseci ili ovako nešto.
Uvijek fali jedan papir.
Uvijek fali jedan papir i onaj ko imaš papir je jučer mu istekao rok. Jer oni ne primaju potvrdu o tvom rođenju koja je starija od 3 mjeseca jer možda si se rodio ponovno u zadnja 3 mjeseca. Ali, gle, samo to promatram i shvaćam da ti ljudi postupaju iz svojih rana. Jer ono što je fascinantno, znači čovjek koji je zlostavljan na bilo koji način, ti bi očekivao da je njegova najveća želja da ne bude zlostavljan. Ali nije. Njegova najveća želja je da nađe drugu osobu u kući on zlostavlja. I onda kad vidiš da je neko na toj sitnoj poziciji moći, može biti ono pošta, banka, bilo šta, šalter, osobito osoran, to znači da je na neki način bio zlostavljan, da on nije sretan, uspješan i veseo, on ne slijedi svoju strast, on je tu samo zato što vjeruje da mora, radije ne bi i iskrcava svoje frustracije sve oko sebe i onda mu oprostiš. Ali da, nisam presretan kad moram raditi izvještaje kojima će dokazati svoju nevinost nekoj osobi koju zapravo uopće to ne zanima. Da je samo dobila zadatak da
to provede.
Da nazove ovih 100 udruga i naplati neki porez od njih ili uzme neki dokument ili neku kaznu ili nešto. Tako da, gle, s druge strane, gledaš budućnost i kažeš taj će posao biti automatiziran uskoro. I sad to može biti dobro i loše, jer ovisno o tome koje su namjere onoga ko to automatizira. Ako onaj ko to automatizira to želi iskoristiti za nadgledanje, nadzor i kontrolu, onda je to gore nego da to rade ljudi. Ako ćemo to napraviti na način... Kažem ti, sve to počinje od osobne perspektive, koja je velikim dijelom utjecana vanjskom perspektivom. Pričaju mi moji prijatelji koji recimo imaju firme u Estoniji. Ista stvar vrijedi za Njemačku, ista stvar vrijedi za Englesku. Dakle, nema tamo izvlačenja od poreza, ali ako ti neki porez nisi obračunao dobro, onda ti oni savjetuju kako da ti to napraviš bolje. I to je sve. Ne idu džonom. Nije ideja da...
Korektivno je, podržavajuće u biti.
Podržavajuće, tako je. Kad u Engleskoj se mijenja neki parametar poreznog sustava, neki porez sa 13% ide na 16%. To se najavi 3 godine unaprijed. Da se ti stigneš pripremiti.
Da. To je skroz jedna druga dimenzija.
Neko naša fiskalizacija F2 koja je najavljena 1.9. a onda 1.1. to sve mora funkcionirati.
Da.
Ja sam bio u IT industriji. Ja nisam siguran kako bi ja taj projekt ishnula u 4 mjeseca. To je ozbiljan komad posla.
Ali zato je šteka sada jer je u principu nije dobra priprema napravljena.
Čak ne pričam ništa o sustavu na strani porezne, u to nemam uvid, to knjigovođe imaju bolji uvid, ali ja čisto gledam ove brojne sad web servise za izdavanje računa koji sad moraju to...
Da, se povezati.
Čutim, 3 mjeseca je na knap za tako nešto, a još barem 6 mjeseci bi to trebalo testirati. Tako da, to je napravljeno navrat na nos. Ovo ti rekao.
Vidimo rezultat.
Možda je namjera iza toga dobra.
Da.
Ne kažem da nije. Može se zloupotrijebiti. Zato što do sada je porezna imala samo podatke o ukupnom iznosu računa. Sad imaju uvid u svaku stavku i još je kategorizirano samim kategorijama. To može biti upotrebljeno tako dobro, može biti upotrebljeno za loše. I onda shvatiš da tvoj posao kao nekog ko pokušava unijeti neku promjenu u svijet. Tvoj posao nije na sustavima. Tvoj posao je na pojedinim ljudima. I oni koji su u tom, recimo sad smo došli na taj porezni sustav, oni koji su tu zbog strasti i veselja, jer da se razumijemo, meni je blistavo jasno da taj porez koji ja plaćam dijelom dobije moj tatak kroz penziju. Ništa protiv toga da ja doprinosim.
Da, na taj
ja
način.
želim da moj susjed ima kanalizaciju, čak i ako je nema para platiti. To bude dobro. Da njegove otpadne vode ne stoje u njegovom dvorištu, nego da negdje odu. Ja sam to spreman financirati. Samo ajmo se ponašati ko su radnici. Ajmo se praviti ko da surađujemo.
Ko da imamo biti dobar zajednički tim.
Ali to ne radiš tako što ćeš sad izvršiti pritisak na sustav. To je ona greška koju sad dobivamo popravni baš u ovim godinama, ovim danima. Stari pristup bi kaže, izabrat ćemo još moćnije glavu, predsjednika, tiranina, autokratu koji će onda, koristeći snažne metode prisile, policiju, šta god, tajnicu i mehanizme, će prisiliti ljude da budu dobri. To je top to bottom approach i s tim je gotovo, to više ne radi. Svijet će se transformirati, ali ne od ozga prema dole, nego od ozga prema gore. Mi moramo svakog pojedinog pojedinca ohrabriti. Da on slijedi svoju strast, da radi ono što je njemu smisleno, jer znamo, možemo na nivou informacije, možemo na nivou intuicije, da je to jedna slika koja je već kompletna, ta slika već funkcionira, svi puzzlovi su već na pravom mjestu, nismo mi tu slučajno, nije moja strast slučajno ova, tvoja strast slučajno ova. Te se stvari savršeno događaju, jedino što treba prekinut je to nasilje uma, jer ti ćeš reći to što je moja najveća strast pjevat. Pa nisam ja Madonna, pa neću nikad biti Madonna, pa ne mogu ja od toga živit. Ja moram raditi nešto što me ne uzbuđuje, što radim preko volje, samo zato da bi dobila neke novce i onda ću biti frustrirana, ću tu frustraciju prenositi na svoju obitelj i na svoje prijatelje, pa će i oni biti frustrirani, pa ću i njima govoriti ako pokušavaju slijediti svoju strast, pa jeste vi normalni, pa ne može se od toga živjeti i tako dalje i tako dalje. I onda sami stvorimo jednu realnost koja je neugodna. Tako da, ova nova transformacija koja dolazi je bottom up. Naše nije da mijenjamo institucije, one će se promijeniti same. Naše je da ohrabrujemo ljude da slijede svoju strast.
Sergio, ovo je fantastična završna poruka. To smo puno puta otvorili, spomenuli i ponavljat ćemo vjerojatno još jako puno puta, jer je to put do onog unutarnje radosti, a onda i onog nekog vanjskog zadovoljstva.
Put Meraklisa.
Da, put Meraklisa. Puno ti hvala, jako sam uživala u ovom razgovoru, jako volim kad ulazimo u dubine i širine. Naravno, mogla bi otvoriti još puno tema, ali to ćemo onda pustiti za neki novi susret. Imaš li ti možda još neku poruku za kraj za naše pratitelje?
Samo hrabro. To je jedino. Hrabrost ne znači nemat strah. Hrabrost znači primijetiti svoj strah, mentalno ga izanalizirati. Ako vam padne na pamet skoči sa nebodera, to nije najbolja ideja. To mentalno izanaliziraš i odmah znaš šta ti je. Ali tvoj strah da ne postupaš po svom srcu je iluzoran. I hrabrost, kad kažem imati hrabrost, to ne znači da strah nestane. To se neće nikad dogoditi. Da ga promotriš i da napraviš nešto što treba biti napravljeno sve.
Hvala ti. Ja ću ponoviti. Znači, idite svojim putem hrabro, bez obzira kakve se prepreke događaju. Ustrajte u tome da pronađete svoju strast, da je slijedite, da je razvijete, da je materializirajte. Tražite svoje meraklisi, budite meraklisi. U ovoj epizodi smo otvorili jako puno toga. Ako vam se svidjelo, zapratite nas i za nove epizode i za nove goste. Vidimo se u sljedećoj epizodi.
Možemo jednu riječ promijeniti.
Naravno.
Nemojte tražiti svoju strast, ne treba tražiti svoju strast. Treba samo prestati se opirati tome da ti se ona ukaže.
Odlično. Hvala. Mogu te zagrut.
The ancient nations of Europe must unite. If they unite, then, in colloquial English, it is game over for the Western ruling elites. There is a struggle for power between the Trump administration and the American deep state. So, when the Trump administration put forward its peace plan for Ukraine, immediately the American deep state, the British deep state, and the European Union took it upon themselves to severely change the Trump peace plan. I have said consistently that the outcome will be decided on the battlefield, and as a result, the Russian military will capture either all or most of Ukraine. There will be no peaceful solution to the war. The Western ruling elites know the best way of killing a nation is not through military means. It's through destroying their national identities, through destroying their culture. If you take away Western mainstream media, then how can the Western ruling elites continue to argue that the Western world is free when they have lost their voice box? Is there democracy, real democracy, in the Serb Republic? The answer is no. How can there be democracy there when it's ruled by the Western ruling elites, when it's a NATO protectorate? How can it be? That is impossible.
Hello and welcome to the Weight of Change podcast. My name is Boris Malagursky. Tonight's guest is one of the most direct and informed voices on international affairs. Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos is a historian, author, and commentator specializing in Russia, the former Yugoslavia, and European politics. He's the editor of Politics First magazine and a regular on international media outlets. With a PhD in Russian and Soviet history, he spent years exposing the deeper forces behind the headlines, from NATO's expansion to the West's selective use of international law. He's also the author of Arise Russia, The Return of Russia to World Politics, a deep dive into how Russia clawed its way back onto the world stage. Marcus is known for challenging the mainstream Western narrative, whether on Ukraine, Syria, or the Balkans, and backing it up with serious historical perspective. Tonight, we're talking about the geopolitical storm surrounding Ukraine and Russia, America's shifting role, and the EU's growing contradictions. But we're also zooming in on the Balkans, especially Bosnia, where the High Representative's attempt to disrupt democracy has raised serious questions about sovereignty and foreign overreach. Is Western policy in the region evolving or repeating old mistakes? And more importantly, what should the world brace for in the months ahead? Dr. Papadopoulos, thank you for joining the Weight of Change podcast.
Thank you ever so much, Boris, for having me on your show, and I'm very much looking forward to our discussion.
Well, let's look at what's happening in Ukraine right now. We have Donald Trump trying to put forward this peace deal, trying to convince Zelensky to accept it. We've seen the Russians say that this is, a good starting point for negotiations on a peace deal. What do you think is going to be the result of this American initiative for the end to the Ukraine war?
Since the Russian military campaign began in Ukraine in February of 2022, I have said consistently that the outcome will be decided on the battlefield. And as a result, the Russian military will capture either all or most of Ukraine. There will be no peaceful solution to the war. And whilst that pains me to say, I am being brutally realistic. The Russians have said from the very start that Ukraine must be demilitarized. Secondly, that NATO must put into writing that Ukraine will never be admitted to the military bloc as a member. And thirdly, the ruling cabal in Kiev must be removed from power. Now, Donald Trump, whom I believe would like to see a peaceful solution to the war in Ukraine, is not fully in charge in America. There is a struggle for power between the Trump administration and the American deep state. So, when the Trump administration put forward its peace plan for Ukraine, immediately the American deep state, the British deep state, and the European Union took it upon themselves to severely change the Trump peace plan. And as a result, it was inevitable that the Kremlin would reject it. Why? Because the amended peace plan involved NATO membership for Ukraine being on the table, and it also involved Ukraine remaining a militarized country, namely being allowed to have 600,000 soldiers. So that is why the Kremlin rejected it. At the same time, since the beginning of this year, I have argued that it is more than conceivable that there is a secret agreement between the Trump administration and the Kremlin regarding Ukraine, in that the Trump administration has agreed to give Russia a free hand in Ukraine. And in response, the Kremlin has agreed to give America a free hand in various parts of the world. Now, I believe that my theory has gained more and more credence. Why? The Trump administration, or the advisors to Trump, would have told him that it is only inevitable that the Kremlin will reject the amended peace plan for the reasons I have already outlined. And yet, Trump still persisted in saying that, quote, peace could be on the horizon for Ukraine, end of quote. I believe that what we are seeing at the moment between the Trump administration and the Kremlin is an act. I believe that both sides are concealing a secret agreement.
But if it is an act, if this whole peace deal is, you know, a distraction, what is the purpose of it? What is this peace proposal supposed to be telling the world while something happens?
Trump and the people around him clearly do not believe that the war in Ukraine is of interest to America, that it doesn't threaten American national security. They also have a very negative perception of NATO, the Western military bloc. Therefore, and on top of that, they do not perceive Russia as an enemy. Therefore, they understand that Ukraine means a great deal, not just to the Kremlin, but to the Russian people as a whole, not just from a national security perspective, but from a cultural perspective. Therefore, the Trump administration, I believe, will have said to the Kremlin that we can resolve this to the satisfaction to you and to our satisfaction, but we have to be very careful about this. We have to try and conceal it. So the summit a few months ago in Alaska between Putin and Trump, and then a few days later, the meeting at the White House between Trump and numerous European leaders amounted to nothing. I said that at the time on television. It doesn't mean anything because Trump is not fully in power. Is he trying to achieve something at the expense of the American deep state? Yes, I believe he is. And I just want to clarify, I do not believe Trump is a savior for America or for the Western world or for Western civilization. But I believe that some good has come from his presidency. And being in Britain, I will take whatever piece of good news comes from America, because any positive development in America will have positive positive developments for Britain. So even if I take 5% away from the Trump administration, 5% is better than nothing. Something is better than nothing. But history teaches us that secret agreements have been made. The Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire had a secret agreement over Bosnia and Herzegovina when the Russians permitted the Austrians to annex Bosnia, and in response, the Austrians said to the Russians, we will support the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles being open to the Russian Navy, or later on the Navy, but still secret agreements are made. And if we accept what I'm saying, if we accept that there's even a kernel of truth to what I'm saying, then the Alaska summit and the current peace plan, we can only conclude amounts to nothing.
Well, you said that the Trump administration is at odds with NATO. There are some who say that, Trump would never leave, would never have NATO because it's a big military alliance that America controls, and why would they give up so much control? And then there are some who say that Trump will or at least should leave NATO. What do you think is a realistic option?
I think it is unlikely that America will leave NATO because Trump is not fully in charge. Again, Trump is no savior, but he clearly has disdain for NATO and even more disdain for the European Union. And at the same time, America and the European Union and NATO are they are completely interdependent. So Trump, even if he was able to wrestle control away from the American deep state, he simply doesn't have the time to fully withdraw America from what are very dangerous, expansionist, aggressive organizations, principally NATO, but also the European Union, because the European Union and NATO are very closely aligned politically, economically, and strategically. But nonetheless, by Trump and the Trump administration as a whole putting a spotlight on organizations like NATO and the European Union, this is instigating a discussion which didn't exist before, for example, in America and in Britain, because as a result, or partly as a result, many people in America and many people in Britain are now openly questioning NATO. They are openly questioning the propaganda which is put out about NATO, that it is a peaceful military bloc. Indeed, many people in Britain and in America are now questioning NATO as far back as 1999, when NATO, as we both know, And that is a very positive development, and we should rejoice about that. Partly as a result of Trump putting a spotlight on NATO, people feel an impetus. If the American president can question NATO, then we, as ordinary people, can question NATO. So no, I don't believe that America will withdraw from NATO, but clearly all is not well within the Western military bloc.
You actually read some reports that Trump is planning on pulling some European states out of the EU for his Make Great Again agenda. Do you think there's any truth to this, and which nations could be involved in this?
I find that very difficult to believe. Europe, and I mean continental Europe and Britain, can only be saved through revolution, either a patriotic revolution or a nationalist revolution. There is no way that Trump can bring about a situation where members of the European Union withdraw, for example, Hungary or Slovakia. No, people across Europe, across the European continent, need to come together, and they need to say, if we do not liberate ourselves, if we do not restore our national identities, if we do not restore our cultural and spiritual values, then we have no future. Our children will have no future. Our grandchildren will have no future, because the European Union, aided and abetted by NATO, is flooding Europe with immigrants. And you don't need to be a mathematician to work out that these immigrants have far more children than people in France, or in Germany, or in Sweden, or in Greece. And therefore the day will come when there are more people in Europe who stem from immigration than there are natives. So I don't know much about what you have said. I have heard something about it. But no, the onus is on the people of Europe to come together and say, we must liberate ourselves, or there will be no future for ourselves.
You mentioned migration. Criticizing immigration policies in Europe usually gets you a label of being a racist, right? Everybody just says, "Oh, you're racist if you don't like people coming in here." And then there are those who say, "Well, I have nothing against immigration. I have something against uncontrolled immigration. If a lot of people move to a country in a very short period of time, there's not enough time to assimilate them. They usually end up being surrounded by their own community, and they don't really have any contact with the native community." What is the main issue with migration? Like, a lot of people are against it, but what is the main reason? Why are they against it?
First of all, Boris, there is the real definition of racism, and then there is the fake definition of racism. The globalists, or what I call the Western ruling elites, have put out a fake definition, whereby racism means that someone opposes immigration and someone opposes multiculturalism. That is a fake definition. The real definition of racism is where someone believes that their race is superior over other races, and that there are some races which are inferior to his or her race. That is racism. So, I do not care in the slightest bit what someone calls me, because I know that I do not have blood in my veins, both in terms of domestic policies and in terms of overseas policies. The reason why people such as myself in Europe or in the rest of the Western world oppose immigration is that it threatens the very existence of the native populations of the Western world. It threatens the cultural and spiritual values of the peoples of the Western world. It threatens Western civilization. I have nothing against Indian people. I have nothing against Pakistani people or people from North Africa or people from sub-Saharan Africa. I wish them the best of luck in life. I am very well aware, as I have been saying for some 20 years now, that the Western ruling elites have caused these countries many problems. However, I believe that each country must defend its population, and in no way does immigration serve the interests of the native population of the Western world. So that is why people in Europe and in the rest of the Western world have finally woken up. They're finally woken up to reality. They do not live in a democracy. They live in a tyranny and in a kleptocracy. They are ruled by people who hate them, who hate their very identity, who hate their existence, who hate their heritage. And unless this is stopped, as I said moments ago, there will be no future for the ancient nations of Europe, for the nations of the Western world as a whole, and for Western civilization.
Well, it's interesting you say there's no democracy in Western countries. When you listen to the media, politicians in Western countries, it seems that all they talk about is democracy. They're spreading democracy around the world, and Russia isn't a democracy. China, they are a democracy, while ignoring the fact that you've had the situation in Romania where a candidate for president was basically banned from running after the election results were cancelled. You have attempts in Germany to ban the most popular political party, which is the AfD. You had persecution of Marine Le Pen in France, as the biggest single political party in France. After all, so many examples, and you had the whole thing in Moldova, which I'm not going to get into right now. But the point is, how can these countries still call themselves democracies, and why aren't the people fighting more for their right to shape their own countries and the way they work?
Because they have to maintain, they have to preserve the facade that the Western world is a democracy. The Western world is free. Otherwise, what else do they have to say? How else can they justify their positions of power? How else can they justify their policies? North Korea, which has achieved many successes, for example in education and in health, is nonetheless a tyranny. And I would describe it as a stupid tyranny. It is an overt tyranny. The Western world, especially Britain, is a tyranny, but a clever tyranny. There is an enormous amount of makeup, which still for some people conceals the true nature of the Western world, namely that it is a tyranny and a kleptocracy. On top of that, the Western world has at its disposal Western mainstream media. Whilst, for example, British mainstream media is dying, and thank God for that, because it has so much blood on its hands, nonetheless, Western mainstream media as a whole still has a lot of influence and power in the world. So that is why, for so long, the facade of the Western world being a democracy and being free has managed to struggle on. If you take away Western mainstream media, then how could the Western ruling elites continue to argue that the Western world is free when they have lost their voice box? And the examples, Boris, you cited regarding Romania and regarding Germany, are very powerful arguments to corroborate what we all know, that the Western world, for example, Europe, is neither free nor democratic. And I would urge people to read the works of great philosophers such as John Milton, John Locke, and John Stuart Mill. For example, Paradise Lost, the poem Paradise Lost by John Milton, whereby they all said that when a king acts in the interests of himself and not in the interests of his people, then the kingdom is no longer a democracy. It is not in the interests of the British people, the American people, the German people, or the French people for the British state or the American state or the German state to have flooded these countries with immigrants. It is not in the interests of the British people, the American people, the German people to have had their culture eroded and to have had multiculturalism imposed on them. It is not in the interest of the aforementioned countries for billions of their dollars or billions of their pounds or billions of their euros to be sent overseas, for example, to Ukraine. And it is not in their interests to cause tension with Russia, which is a military and nuclear superpower. It is not in their interests to privatize companies in the aforementioned countries and then to outsource jobs abroad, for example, to India, denying people, for example, in Britain, of those jobs. So people should read the works of Milton, Locke, and Stuart Mill. Real men, real intellectuals, real patriots, men who truly believed in democracy, in true democracy.
Well, aside from there being some people who actually believe in everything that's being presented as part of the facade, you have people who understand what's going on, or at least feel that something's up, something's wrong, and have the urge to resist. But a lot of them end up being arrested. I mean, I read this figure somewhere that about 5,000 people were taken into custody in Germany, and we talked about the UK, which I don't think a lot of people, especially outside of outside the UK, apologies, I don't think a lot of people know just how dramatic it is in the UK. I mean, we've seen some clips online of police officers just going in and saying, "Oh, you posted this on Facebook. We're gonna take you down to the station." And people are like, "What do you mean? Just because of something I posted on Facebook?" And they're like, "Yeah, you just have to go on down to the station." And we've seen scenes of police, taking down UK flags. I mean, as if the flag is a provocation, in if used in a certain context, and it just boggles the mind, for somebody who has for so many years believed in this idea that you have all these authoritarian regimes in the East, but when you go to the West, it's all freedom and prosperity, and you can say whatever you want, and maybe you can't even for those skeptics, you can't change the system, but at least you have freedom of speech. You can say whatever you want, even if that doesn't make a difference. You can say whatever you want. Now it seems that even that area of our collective freedom is being diminished.
Britain is the most dangerous country in the Western world when it comes to free speech. The UK police is not a proper police. It is a political police force. And that is something that I and others have been saying for many, many years. Well before the pandemic, well before that, the writing was on the wall that Britain was becoming a police state. And the evidence is simply overwhelming now. The evidence is that people are receiving knocks on the door, that people are being arrested for expressing an opinion from even though they've been found guilty of rape, they are being released from court. Not so long ago, the Home Office, which Europe will be known equivalent would be the Interior Ministry, went to law in Britain, in England, to argue that the rights of illegal immigrants effectively trump the rights of British people. First of all, a government has said government. Are they working in the interest of the people? The response of the judge was to agree with what the Home Office said, that the rights of the Aboriginals surpass the rights of the native. I say to politicians, even though they're puppets, they're useful infants, they're not in control. I say to politicians, civil servants, to police officers, to journalists, etc., to be very careful, because, quote, following orders, end quote, is no defence in law. That was established at the Nuremberg trials. And whilst I have numerous criticisms of the Nuremberg trials, I wholeheartedly support the ruling that, quote, following orders, end quote, is no defence. So it is no defence under British law, and it is no defence under international law. Whatever those groups are being paid, their big fat paychecks, no matter how big and fat their pensions are, they are complicit in crimes against humanity. I think some of them, Boris, are starting to realise that and are becoming worried. Others aren't aware of that. But I urge people again to read what happened at the Nuremberg trials. You don't have to agree with everything that the judges from the Grand Alliance had to say, because I certainly don't. But they were right that there is no defence to there is no defence to I'm simply obeying orders.
But those who are obeying orders and those who are sending those police officers to arrest people say that, you know, the people who are being arrested and who are being charged, they're inciting hatred. They're you know, it's a crime. It's a hate crime to say that you're, you know, you don't want some people living in your neighborhood or stuff like that, you know. So this is, you know, their sort of way of creating a perfect society, as they probably think they're doing. What would you say to those arguments?
Free speech does have limits, namely, and only namely, you cannot incite violence. That's a separate matter. But other than that, free speech means free speech. If you're opposed to immigration, you can say it. If you're opposed to multiculturalism, you can say it. If you believe that Europe's Christian identity must be preserved, you can say it. There is no such thing in criminal law as, quote, causing offence. Causing offence never has been and never will be a crime. But what we are seeing in Britain and in other Western countries, and let us not forget the other parts of the British Kingdom, such as Canada and Australia, what we are now seeing is more and more hate crime legislation emerging. Why? Because the British ruling elite, which of course rules Canada, Australia and New Zealand, as well as the mother country, Britain, and countries such as Germany, realise that their populations now see them for what they are, and they feel threatened. Their hold on power is threatened, coupled with the 2030 agenda, which is now only 4 years away. So in order to preserve their dictatorial rule in order to achieve the 2030 agenda, which will mean a digital prison for the nations of the Western world, they have to introduce more and more so-called hate crime legislation. They have to intimidate people. They have to terrify people. They have to beat down people. They have to ultimately subdue people. It's in response to the awakening which we see in the Western world, the spiritual awakening where so many people are resurrecting their Christian faith, or they are finding Christianity, where people are resurrecting their culture, where people are saying, do not attack me, my people, my history, my heritage. Enough is enough. So you see why the Western ruling elites, or if you want to call them the globalists, are now responding with very, very harsh, cruel measures. History teaches us that this is what dictatorial regimes do when they are in trouble. They resort to violence. They resort to repression. So history never ends. And like for what that imbecile Francis Fukuyama said in his book in 1992, The End of History, another imbecile, history does not end. History continues. So if we want to learn something from history, if we want to increase our optimism that all is not lost for us in the Western world, yes, the situation is extremely grave, including in Serbia, we must, of course, stay true to our spiritual identity, Christianity. We must stay true to our culture, but also let's take some positive lessons from history. History teaches us that all is possible, that anything is possible, that all is impermanent. No regime will be in power forever. And also, as I said, history demonstrates that when a regime is threatened, they start to become more and more repressive. And that is exactly what we are seeing across the Western world today.
Yeah, it reminds me of that alleged quote by Idi Amin saying, I guarantee freedom of speech, but I can't guarantee freedom after speech. And really,